The world of college football rivalries stretches far beyond just the top flight of Division 1. In fact, many of the most fierce and historic rivalries in the sport can be found a small step below the Football Bowl Series in what is known as the Football Championship Series. It is here where rivalries can often get taken to extreme lengths, both on and off of the football field, and it also just so happens to be the place where some of these sports' most historic programs and rivalries currently reside. So today, we are going to be taking a look at 12 of the best rivalries in the FCS. Real quick, let me just say here at the start that I will not be including HBCU rivalries in this video, as they will be getting their own entry in the near future. This is mainly just due to it being incredibly hard to rank them all together, while also trying to shine a light on as many rivalries as possible. So with all of that out of the way, let's get this thing started. Starting us off at number 12 is the Riverbell Classic between the Nicholls State Colonels and the Southeastern Louisiana Lions. Currently, as we get set to enter the 2026 season, the Lions hold a very slight 19-17 advantage in the all-time series. The Riverbell Classic originally dates back to 1972, however that original run would only last 14 years, as Southeastern would go on to shut down their football program in 1985, with the rivalry stuck at 7 wins apiece. The Lions would not return to the gridiron until 2003, 18 years later. But it wouldn't be until 2005 that the Riverbell Classic would finally make its triumphant return, with Nicholls breaking the 20-year tie and securing the Riverbell Trophy thanks to a 38-28 victory in Hammond. The trophy at the time looked like this and had been a part of the rivalry ever since its inception back in 1972. But in 2012, the trophy would see a complete redesign and major upgrade to what we have here today. Since the introduction of the new Riverbell Trophy, the rivalry has only continued to grow, having seen many classic battles, as well as some of the rivalry's greatest moments over those past 13 years. One of those classic encounters came back in 2016, in what can only be described as the craziest game in the history of the series. It all started with Southeastern jumping out to an early 14-0 lead before watching the Colonels storm back with 21 unanswered points of their own. The Lions would fight back to retake the lead, and from there, Southeastern looked to be in cruise control the rest of the way. That was until the Colonels would stage a furious rally in the game's waning moments that saw them score 2 touchdowns in the final minute. So it would ultimately come down to a 2-point conversion attempt, which Nicholls would fail to convert on. However, they would go on to recover their second straight onside kick and would get one final Hail Mary into the end zone. That too, though, would go on to fall incomplete, as the Lions would race to the bell to celebrate a 44-42 victory. A few years later in 2019, the two would meet again, but this time there was a playoff spot and a share of the conference title on the line, in what can easily be described as the highest stakes matchup in series history. Once again, the game would turn out to be an instant classic, with both teams swapping the lead multiple times throughout the game. In the end though, it would be Nicholls scoring on a game-winning 57-yard bomb, while Southeastern would go on to see their final chance to respond, and in pure disaster as they fumbled down near the Nicholls goal line. The Riverbell Classic is easily one of the most competitive rivalries in all of the FCS, and that mixed with its many classic battles over the years are why, in my opinion, it deserves its spot on this list. Next up at number 11, we have a rivalry that's potentially on its way out the door in the UC Davis Aggies versus the Sacramento State Hornets in the Causeway Classic. Davis currently holds a commanding 49-23 lead in the overall series, which may have seen its final game thanks to Sacramento State leaving the Big Sky in their pursuit to jump up to the FBS. This also just so happens to be the rivalry behind one of the worst trophy changes across all of college sports. Starting back in the early 1960s and lasting up through the early 90s, the two schools would exchange a vintage carriage that was donated to the rivalry by a Sacramento State alum. Unfortunately, the carriage wasn't in great shape at the time, and the schools quickly got tired of constantly having to pay for it to be repaired. So they would ultimately decide to retire the carriage and introduce the Causeway Classic trophy in the mid-90s. Yes, it is exactly what it looks like, a core sample of concrete from the nearby Yolo Causeway that is somehow meant to represent a prestigious trophy. It has to be amongst the biggest rivalry trophy downgrades of all time. The Aggies have dominated the rivalry throughout most of its history, but over the past decade, it has been reignited by Sacramento State investing heavily into their football program, which has led to a fantastic past and possibly final decade of the rivalry. During that potential final run, the Causeway Classic would see some of its greatest moments over the course of its entire history, like in 2022 for example. At this time, the Hornets were just finishing their rapid ascension to the top of the FCS. They'd entered the final week of the regular season, ranked second in the country, and just one win away from their first undefeated regular season in program history. And early on in that final game, it looked as though they were well on their way to retaining that stupid piece of concrete as well as their undefeated record. But a touchdown by the Aggies at the end of the first half would spark a very spirited rally that would eventually lead to Davis getting the ball back with a chance to put the finishing touches on their epic comeback. But in the end, that comeback would fall just short as the clock would run out on the Aggies after they failed to reach the sideline in the game's final seconds. And how could we not talk about the game from this past season in 2025? It was a winner-take-all game with a spot in the FCS playoffs on the line. In what may have been the last game of the rivalry, at least in the short term, both sides would honor the tradition of the series by producing an absolute thriller. This would include Sacramento State coming back from a 14-0 deficit just to ultimately blow it in the game's final quarter by allowing the Aggies to score 14 unanswered points of their own, while the Hornets meanwhile would go on to see their final drive end in pure misery. Overall, this rivalry has a fantastic history and would be a real shame if it were to come to an end. But one thing I hope we can all agree on is that the Causeway Classic has one of the worst trophies in all of college football. Next up at number 10, we have our first Ivy League entry of this list with the Penn Quakers versus the Princeton Tigers in the rivalry that Princeton won't accept. Currently, the Tigers hold a commanding lead in this historic series with 70 wins to the Quakers' 45. But if we were to take the first 28 meetings, all of which were won by Princeton, out of the equation, then the rivalry actually gets incredibly tight. Now, the essence of this rivalry is quite simple. Both are smarty pants institutions that continuously fail to do the right thing, and that is to embrace this rivalry as their true number one. Instead, both schools, but more so Princeton, have chosen the path of chasing after Harvard and Yale instead of embracing their true number one rival. Not only do they have a closer geographical connection to Penn, but they also have a very storied history both on the gridiron as well as the hardwood, and both rivalries are filled with plenty of classic moments and incredible games, and this would be especially true for the modern era. Like for instance in 2013, when Princeton was chasing an Ivy League title entering the matchup at 6-1. However, they would quickly find themselves trailing 16-0 early on to the 4-3 Quakers, who were looking to pull the upset on their home turf. But that was just the wake-up call that Princeton needed, as they would produce an electrifying comeback that would see them outscore the Quakers 38-10 the rest of the way, securing a 38-26 victory on Franklin Field. Nearly a decade later in 2022, this great Ivy League rivalry would add yet another legendary moment to its already incredible history. At the time, the Tigers were 7-1 overall and were looking for a win and a Yale loss to secure them the Ivy League title. And for a majority of the game, it looked as though they were easily going to succeed in that crucial first step. This especially looked to be the case after a 92-yard fumble return gave them a 19-7 lead early in the third quarter. But the 7-2 Penn Quakers had absolutely zero intent of letting Princeton walk away with an easy victory, especially after the 3 previous seasons ended in beatdowns at the paws of the Tigers. So when Penn forced a game-changing turnover of their own late in the third quarter, you already knew the comeback was inevitable.
Sayin with twin tight end, Starks in motion. Julian Stokes takes the handoff and plunges his way in for the touchdown. 1-0. They snap the football at 0. Towards the end zone. Touchdown!
Now, this rivalry has so much potential if both schools and fan bases were willing to truly embrace it as their number one. When you look at the landscape of college football, as the FBS continues to stray away from true college football, it gives all the more opportunity for rivalries like this to gain more attention and respect. They already have a very storied history and a close geographical connection. It's time for them to finally put aside the nonsense and let the hate flow. Moving on, next up at number 9, we have one of the most heated rivalries in all of the FCS between the Citadel Bulldogs and the Furman Paladins. The Paladins currently hold a commanding 65-37 advantage in the overall series, though a lot of that difference can be traced back to the earliest years of the rivalry. Now, for some, they may consider swapping out either school or Wofford, as the trio all have deep and historic rivalries and have no shortage of heated tension. But I'm going to go with Citadel versus Furman due to it being the oldest and most competitive in the modern era. For these two bitter rivals, the difference is quite simple. Citadel is a military school that prides itself on its history and its military traditions. Meanwhile, Furman, on the other hand, are a school that focuses heavily on having top-flight academics, while also being seen as a place for some of the most wealthy in the region. It's that split that really defines the foundation of this rivalry. There is also some very interesting off-the-field lore that goes along with it as well, like in 1963, for example, when Citadel cadets kidnapped the horse that Furman used as their mascot prior to the big game. The horse would eventually be returned after the contest, which saw Furman win for the second year in a row via a 34-25 score. Meanwhile, in the modern era, these two schools have produced a ton of incredible games that have come down to the wire. Like in 2007, for instance, when the two squads had an epic back and forth shootout in Charleston that would end up being one of the highest scoring games in the history of the series. Furman would take a 41-31 lead into the final quarter on that afternoon, but the Bulldogs would storm all the way back to eventually steal the lead in the final minutes of the game. But that lead would only last a few seconds, as Furman would answer on the ensuing kickoff with a 76-yard return that would put them right back out in front. Citadel would find a way to answer to force overtime, where they would finally end the game with a 5-yard touchdown run that would give the Bulldogs a 54-51 victory. Another classic moment from this rivalry came back in 2024. On this day, the Paladins had looked completely lifeless through 3 quarters of play. In fact, they had less than 20 total snaps in the entire first half of this game, and they would trail 16-3 early in the 4th quarter after a Citadel field goal that looked to all but be the dagger in Furman's heart. But over the final 8 minutes of the game, the Paladins would stage an epic comeback that would include back-to-back double-digit play drives that would eventually see them take the lead with a minute left on the clock. That lead would hold, as Furman would walk away with their 4th straight victory in the series. In all, this is one of the most historic rivalries in the FCS, and that mixed with its high propensity to produce classic games made it an obvious selection for this list. Moving on, next up at number 8, we have the South Dakota Showdown series between the South Dakota Coyotes and the South Dakota State Jackrabbits. At this current moment, South Dakota State holds a slim 58-53 advantage over their in-state rival. But despite that close disparity, the rivalry has seen South Dakota State dominate for nearly all of the 21st century thus far. But you see, back before the Jackrabbits made the jump up to Division I back in 2004, this rivalry was seen as one of the fiercest in all of Division II. It was during those days where South Dakota did a majority of their damage. It also just so happened to be the time where both schools would see their fan bases start one of the wildest traditions in all of college sports. Starting back in the early to mid 1960s and lasting up through 1976, the two fan bases would engage in a new tradition of tossing either a dead rabbit or a dead coyote out onto the basketball court during their annual rivalry game every year. This would end though in 1976 after a cheerleader was injured when South Dakota State fans threw a 55-pound frozen coyote towards the court. After that event, the schools became very strict about ending said tradition. However, it has seen a few small comeback attempts over the years, like in 2011 when Jackrabbits fans hung a dead coyote from a billboard in Brookings that the University of South Dakota had purchased to promote the return of the rivalry. But beyond its weird fascination with dead animals, this rivalry has also been known to produce plenty of incredible moments on the gridiron, and that would be especially true for its most recent stretch. Look no further than their classic Hail Mary game from 2021. It was just 2 years after the Oats finally snapped a 10-game losing streak and got their first Division I win over South Dakota State. And in this moment, they would go on to produce one of the greatest moments in the history of the rivalry. It was a true statement game that would declare that the rivalry was indeed back and better than ever. On this day, the Jackrabbits looked to be on the verge of reasserting their dominance after a touchdown midway through the fourth quarter paired with a big fourth down stop suddenly had them bleeding what looked to be all of the clock. But upon further review, they had left a single second remaining. And you see, the college football gods really only have one punishment for such mistakes. Well, let's just say it has not changed over time.
Camp under pressure, lets it fly, almost gets it to the end zone, deflected up in the air, called touchdown, South Dakota!
My gosh, you have got to be kidding me.
Golden rule here, kids. If you have a chance to bleed every second off of the clock, make sure you do in fact bleed every second off the clock. A few years later in 2024, the Jackrabbits would get their revenge by winning the first overtime game in the history of this series. This time, both teams would enter the matchup ranked inside the top 5 in the FCS, making it one of the most anticipated games of the season. And as one would expect, it proceeded to live up to that billing. South Dakota State again looked poised to win in the game's final moments. However, they would see a disastrous fumble lead to a tie game in an eventual overtime. But it was here where the Jackrabbits, who were desperate to avoid a second straight loss on the season, would make their definitive stand. Now, this rivalry may have spent close to 20 years, either dormant or as a national afterthought, but it's back and its future looks to be amongst the brightest in all of the FCS. Next up at number 7, it's the battle for the Capital Cup between the Richmond Spiders and the William and Mary Tribe. Richmond currently holds a slight 67-64 advantage in the all-time series, and they've also had the edge in more recent times, going 17-5 over the past 22 meetings. But the true essence of this rivalry, beyond it historically being very competitive, is the fact this is a true grassroots rivalry of college football. To start, it is historically one of the most played rivalries in the sport, having seen over 135 total meetings all time. Local bragging rights are also a major focus of the rivalry, with both schools being stationed inside the state of Virginia and located just an hour's drive away from one another. And to top things off, both are regarded as highly ranking academic institutions. All of these things add up to make it a true grassroots rivalry of college football. And as one would expect, there has been absolutely no shortage of memorable moments over its storied history. Just look no further than their incredible battle from 2011. It wasn't a game with a playoff spot or a conference title on the line, but rather just a simple game for ultimate bragging rights between two bitter in-state rivals. On this day, the Tribe looked to be the better squad of the two, as they would go on to lead for a majority of the contest. But then came the fourth quarter, and with it would come a rejuvenated Richmond squad that was looking to defend their home turf and get revenge for the 41-3 beatdown from the year prior. With time running out, the Spiders would put together a pair of touchdown drives that would suddenly see them take a 23-19 lead with just 4.5 minutes left on the clock. With the game hanging in the balance, the Tribe would go on an incredible 18-play drive that would cover 74 yards before they finally put the ball in the end zone with just 2 seconds left in the game, securing a wild 25-23 victory in the process. Another classic Capital Cup battle came just a few years ago in 2023. This time, Richmond is looking to clinch a share of the CAA conference title, while William and Mary had plans on spoiling their afternoon with a major upset. But despite taking the lead early on in that contest, the Tribe would find themselves trailing by 10 late in the game, and it was here where the green and yellow would start to turn up the heat just a little bit. Over the final 8 minutes of that game, the Tribe would put together two massive drives that would suddenly see them lining up for a 2-point conversion attempt to win the game. Unfortunately for them, the comeback would end there as the Spiders would get the stop, securing a 27-26 victory. The Capital Cup may not include perennial national title contenders, but it's historically a very important rivalry to the sport and one that embraces the true roots of college football, which in my opinion is why it deserves its spot on this list. Next up at number 6, we have a massively underrated rivalry between the Southeastern Missouri State Redhawks and the Southern Illinois Salukis in what is known as the War for the Wheel. Now at this current moment, the Redhawks hold a slim 44-41 advantage over their rivals to the northeast. To start, like many others on this list, this rivalry has a long and storied history that stretches back well over a century, having seen over 90 total meetings all time. And during its earliest years, it would include one of the coolest traditions in the entire sport, as the visiting team each year would have to cross the Mississippi River by boat prior to the big game. This would end though after Southern Illinois had an issue with one of their boats, causing it to sink and forcing the team to swim ashore. But despite that incredible background, it took an entire century for the two schools to finally come together to introduce an old school shipping wheel as the rivalry's new trophy. Thus in 2018, with the new trophy set to enter the rivalry, the game would finally receive a nickname, being dubbed the War for the Wheel. Now, unlike many of its contemporaries on this list, the War for the Wheel is a non-conference rivalry, and it has been one throughout its entire history, which makes it all the more impressive that both sides have been able to keep it going strong for such a long period of time. And of course, the rivalry has seen its fair share of epic showdowns on the gridiron over its 90+ meetings. One of those notable showdowns came back in 2018. It was a game that'll forever be remembered, not just because it was the very first War for the Wheel, but also due to the ridiculous amount of sheer madness that it somehow packed into 3.5 hours. For starters, it was the highest scoring game in the history of the series, with both teams eclipsing the 40-point mark. To add to the madness, the game would see over 250 yards worth of accepted penalties, but the biggest story of the day was Redhawks running back Marquise Taylor, who went on to break the school and conference record for rushing yards in a game with an insane 311-yard performance that also saw him put 4 touchdowns up on the scoreboard. This would include the game-winning score, which came with just over a minute left in the game, securing the very first edition of the newly dubbed War for the Wheel. But it's their matchup from 2023 that most will remember thanks to its chaotic comeback and incredible last-second finish. The Redhawks had entered that game carrying momentum from their upset stunner the year prior, and they would use that to build a 15-0 lead heading into the half. But then, the Salukis would wake up and immediately cut the lead to 2 less than 8 minutes into the third quarter, but they would once again find themselves trailing by double digits come early in the final frame. But thanks to a 13-play drive, they would once again see the lead come back within reach. But that's when disaster nearly struck, as a turnover on downs seemed to put an end to the Salukis' hard-fought comeback. But when it comes to college football rivalry games, nothing is ever as simple as it may seem.
We go. Baker, straight back in the pocket. Has time to the end zone. Touchdown!
The War for the Wheel is one of the most criminally underrated rivalries in all of college football, regardless of division. But no worries, it gets its respect here, and who knows, it may even get its own Wikipedia entry someday. Next up at number 5, it's another underrated rivalry between the Fordham Rams and the Holy Cross Crusaders in the battle for the Ram-Crusader Cup. Holy Cross currently holds the edge in this historic series with 35 wins all time to Fordham's 26. So for those unaware of this rivalry's background, both of these teams were very important to the sport back in its earliest days. In fact, the very first meeting between them back in 1902 came when Holy Cross was near the top of the entire sport in what is widely seen as their most successful period in program history. During that time, the Crusaders were led by legendary head coach Frank Cavanaugh, who also went on to lead Fordham to some of their best years in program history in the late 1920s, which famously set the stage for Jim Crowley's 7 blocks of granite teams of the 1930s that famously included Vince Lombardi. But beyond it being a foundational rivalry to the sport, it's also one of, if not the only college football rivalry to see games played in 3 separate countries, having seen matchups here in the States as well as both Ireland and Bermuda as well. But the main reason why this rivalry deserves to be so high up on this list is mainly due to its incredible ability to produce constant close games and classic moments. Just look no further than their absolutely ridiculous shootout from 2022 for the Patriot League Conference title. To start, it was the final year of the old game clock rules, and in my opinion, a perfect example of why they were superior to the garbage that we currently see today. Just imagine a back and forth shootout in which both teams went on to eclipse the 50-point mark while combining for over 1,000 yards of total offense and over 50 total first downs. It was a perfect illustration of why those old rules were superior in every way. Oh, and there were also 9 punts as well, because special teams deserves to get some run too. In the end, the game would end up going into overtime, because why not? The Rams, who were looking to pull the upset on this day, would strike first by scoring on the very first play of overtime. But Bob Chesney's Crusaders had a special trick saved up for just this very moment.
Here comes the blitz. Sluka to the end zone. Touchdown! Justin Shorter! Sluka, hands, reverse. Ayarasante gallops in. Holy Cross wins!
That was incredible.
A few years later in 2025, the rivalry would see a major historic moment. Entering that game, Fordham had lost the last 8 meetings. Included in that stretch was 3 straight years of single possession losses to their bitter rival. And once again, they would find themselves trailing entering halftime, having already allowed 21 points on the afternoon. But in the second half, the Rams would rewrite the script by not allowing a single point over the final 30 minutes of the game. The Rams offense, meanwhile, would go on to add a pair of field goals to their total to give them a 26-21 victory, securing their first win over the Crusaders since the beatdown in Yankee Stadium back in 2016. Overall, the battle for the Ram-Crusader Cup is one of the most fascinating rivalries in all of the FCS. It may not have 100+ meetings like some of the others on this list, but make no mistake about it, this is still an important rivalry that helped build the foundation of the sport. Moving on, next up at number 4, we have one of the most historic rivalries across the entire sport, with the Harvard Crimson taking on the Yale Bulldogs in what is simply known as the Game. After 141 meetings all time, the Bulldogs currently hold a 72-61 advantage in the series. Now, when it comes to the history of college football, there were very few rivalries that are as deep-rooted to the sport as this one. You see, back in the earliest days of college football, the highest achieving academic schools held an iron grip on the top of the sport, and it was during that period where this rivalry would take center stage as the top one across the country. But it was also during that early period of its history where it would earn a bit of a reputation as one of the most violent games as well. This would culminate in the 1894 Hampton Park bloodbath, which resulted in multiple gruesome injuries, including one player falling into a short-term coma. Ultimately, they would choose to blame each other for the absurd amount of violence over the years, and as a result, they would cease communications and suspend the rivalry for the next 3 years. Thankfully, over the following decades, the two schools would be at the forefront of trying to make the game more safe as regulators sought bans around the country. And thanks to their effort, the game continues to not only survive, but thrive into the modern day. Overall, this series has an incredible amount of history attached to it, with great games and classic moments being able to be found in just about any era. For starters, their iconic game from 1968 will forever live on as one of the wildest comebacks in the history of the sport. For 59 minutes of that game, Yale looked to be the better of the two teams, as entering that final minute, they'd built what looked to be an insurmountable 16-point lead. But then, Harvard would score with just 39 seconds left in the contest, and after a successful 2-point conversion attempt, the unthinkable would happen. Yes, Harvard would go on to recover the ensuing onside kick, and from there, it was all Crimson the rest of the way, as they would easily march down the field before scoring and tying the game with another successful 2-point conversion attempt. The following day, the Harvard newspaper would read Harvard wins 29-29, showing that in the end, the Crimson had won a moral victory. It's widely regarded as one of the greatest college football games of all time, and one that should never be forgotten alongside this great rivalry. But don't be fooled, there's been plenty of modern day classics as well, like their battle in 2019 for example. Despite Yale entering that game as sizable favorites, they would ultimately find themselves trailing 39-26 early in the fourth quarter. But then, the Bulldogs would stage a furious rally that would see them tie the game and send it into overtime, where Yale would eventually put an end to the proceedings, securing a 50-43 victory over their bitter rival. Overall, the game is one of the most historic rivalries in the sport, and its contributions to the foundation of college football should always be respected and celebrated, because at the end of the day, this rivalry is truly what college football is all about in every possible way. Next up at number 3, we have the most played rivalry across all of college football between the Lafayette Leopards and the Lehigh Mountain Hawks. The Leopards currently lead the all-time series with an 82-74 advantage over Lehigh. It's a rivalry that truly needs no introduction. After all, its nickname is literally the rivalry. In fact, these two schools hate each other so much that Lehigh was almost explicitly founded on the idea of rivaling Lafayette College for local and religious supremacy. It all started with a simple difference in religion. On one side, you had the Presbyterians of Lafayette, while on the other, you had the Episcopalians who felt as though they did not have a local university that truly represented them. This would lead to Asa Packer, a local businessman who was vehemently anti-Presbyterian, to fund the founding of Lehigh University in 1865, just 17 miles down the road from Lafayette College. 19 years later, the two schools would meet on the gridiron for the very first time, sparking one of the most intense rivalries across the sport. The rivalry also has plenty of game week traditions that go along with the annual matchup as well, but chief amongst them has to be the game ball being used as the annual trophy every year. Each ball gets marked with the date of the game and the final score before being stored on campus amongst all the others. And of course, with it being such a historic rivalry, there has been no shortage in any era of classic battles and legendary moments. Like back in 1997, for example, where the rivalry would see one of its greatest on-field moments over its 100+ meetings. Heading into that big matchup, both teams were in the midst of rough years, but don't let that fool you, this was still considered one of the most heated points in the rivalry's history. Early on, it looked as though Lafayette was easily going to end the Hawks' 2-game winning streak in the series as they jumped out to a quick 21-0 lead. But this was a spot all too familiar to the Leopards at the time, as they had 16 and 19-point leads in the previous two meetings, and yet they still ended up losing. So when the Hawks came all the way back to bring it within reach, Lafayette fans could sense it happening once again.
But he actually lost a couple of yards in the play. Officially third down. There it is, third wide. And there's the touchdown in choke foul zone. And Lehigh can tie it up with the extra point. Bengals wanted the tri-captains along with Hansen and Stallnecker. Under pressure, snap off to Rabi Abdullah. Abdullah is in for the touchdown, and Lehigh is on top for the first time this afternoon.
Getting the football. Aston or Rabi is getting the football.
Fedorcha in motion. It is Abdullah, and he's in for the touchdown. Rabi Abdullah.
Another major moment in this rivalry came in the one and only meeting contested outside the state of Pennsylvania. The year was 2014, and the two schools decided that in honor of the 150th edition of the rivalry, they would battle it out inside Yankee Stadium. Once again, much like back in '97, Lafayette ran out to a 21-0 lead, only this time there was no comeback set to take place. In one of the biggest games in the rivalry's history, the Leopards would shut down the Mountain Hawks on their way to a 27-7 victory. Overall, this is one of the most iconic and bitter rivalries in all of college football. It doesn't matter if they are scrapping over a conference title or to avoid a winless season. The games continue to mean just as much today as they did during the rivalry's most heated moments, and that's why, in my opinion, it deserves its spot as one of the top rivalries in the FCS. Moving on, next up at number 2, it's the Montana Grizzlies versus the Montana State Bobcats in the Brawl of the Wild. The Grizzlies currently hold a 74-45 advantage over the Bobcats in the all-time series. But despite that large disparity, it should be noted that in the Big Sky era, which dates back to 1963, it has been amongst the most competitive rivalries in all of college football, and during that time, it has burst onto the national scene and become one of the premier rivalry games across the entire country. The game is currently contested for the Great Divide Trophy, which entered the rivalry back in 2001. It's meant to represent the two schools being located on separate sides of the Continental Divide, and it's got to be one of the coolest rivalry trophies in the entire sport, and it weighs in at a whopping 306 pounds. But the key focus of this rivalry is the local bragging rights that come along with winning the game every year. It's the one time a year where families in small towns get torn apart in support of either the Cats or the Grizz, and to top it all off, the game has one of the most picturesque backdrops in all of college football, whether it takes place in Bozeman or in Missoula. And of course, with it being a premier matchup in the sport, there's been absolutely no shortage of instant classics over its long and storied history. And when it comes to those instant classics, there are very few that can match up to their incredible battle from 1997. The Grizzlies had entered that famous matchup carrying an 11-game winning streak over their in-state rival, and once again, they had entered as the clear favorite to take home win number 12. But there was something just a little bit different in the air on this chilly afternoon in Bozeman. It all started with the Grizz jumping out to a 14-7 lead, and this is where things looked as though they would stand heading into halftime. But that's when the Bobcats made a critical error, as they would watch their miscue give the Grizz a second chance at life, which they would use to add 7 more points to their total. But then the second half rolled around, and it was here where the Bobcats would make a determined stand to end the embarrassing 11-game losing streak to their bitter rival. This would culminate in the Bobcats taking the lead with just 22 seconds left on the clock. But just as the party was getting started in Bozeman, the Grizzlies sat patiently, knowing they just needed one more small mistake.
Jeff Groeschel getting set to kick off. Nate Sanders and Brian Gales are back to receive for Montana. The kick is deep and goes out of bounds at the 20-yard line. That is a penalty. Again, 3 receivers to the near side. Ayat in the shotgun. Looking to throw. Has the time, over the middle, going long to Justin Olson, and he's got the football on the 20-yard line, down to the 19. The Grizz call a timeout. A huge play from Ayat to Justin Olson. Here is the kick. Raul Pacheco is your holder. Chris Hepner, 37 yards. The game winner. The kick is up, and it is good. The Montana Grizzlies have come back to win this football game 27-25 over the Montana State Bobcats. The Grizzlies are going nuts on the field. The Bobcats can't believe it.
And how could we not talk about their iconic game from 2018? If there's any game that stands above that incredible clash from '97, it was this showdown from Missoula. Entering that matchup, Montana State had won the last 2 games in the series. However, unlike those games, this one would determine who would go on to the FCS playoffs and which one would go on to start their offseason early. the Grizzlies would go on to land the first several major blows of the game as they would quickly run out to a 22-0 lead. The Bobcats would finally get on the scoreboard just before the half would come to a close, but they would still find themselves trailing 22-7 as they would enter the fourth quarter. With their backs against the wall, the Bobcats would go on to put 3 incredible touchdown drives together that would see them take a 29-25 lead with just over 2 minutes left in the game. But just like back in '97, the Grizz still had one more chance to touch the ball, and once again, it seemed as though they were going to break Bobcats fans' hearts as they would drive all the way down inside the Bobcats' 10-yard line in the game's final seconds. And it was right here where the rivalry would see perhaps its most famous moment over its illustrious 100-plus meetings.
Eastwood did not make it. Ball out. Recovered by Montana State. The Bobcats hold. The Bobcats hold.
In all, the Brawl of the Wild is one of the premier rivalry games across the sport, and its rapid rise has seen it become a bucket list item for most hardcore college football fans around the country. And finally, coming in at number 1, it's the Dakota Marker between the North Dakota State Bison and the South Dakota State Jackrabbits. The Bison currently enjoy a 66-47 advantage in the all-time series, although the two schools are dead even over their past 10 matchups. In its current era, the Dakota Marker has blossomed to become one of the top rivalries in all of the FCS, with national title implications swaying heavily every year dependent on its result. In fact, of their 6 postseason matchups, 5 of those resulted in the winning team going on to capture the national title. But when they compete during the regular season, it's the coveted Dakota Marker that is on the line. The trophy is a 78-pound piece of rock that is a replica of the markers that separate the two states. It was originally introduced to the rivalry back in 2004 when both schools officially made the jump up to Division I, having left their previous major rivals behind. Since then, the Dakota Marker has gone on to become one of the premier rivalries in all of college football, and both schools have seen incredible success during that time, combining for 12 national titles. Thanks to that success, the rivalry has become a must-watch game even for the most casual of college football fans, and that is especially true for when they match up during the postseason. That reputation has been earned through multiple incredible playoff battles, like in 2014 for example. At the time, the Bison were the 3-time defending national champions, and they had won 6 consecutive matchups against the Bison heading in. Led by future second overall pick Carson Wentz, they looked like an easy lock for title number 4. So when they took a 14-0 lead early in the second quarter, nobody was shocked, and many thought it could become a rout at that point. But the Jacks were determined to not let the Bison run away with it like they did in their meeting the month prior. With South Dakota State getting help in all 3 phases of the game, they would come all the way back to eventually take the lead for the second time with less than 3.5 minutes remaining in the contest. But just as though it looked as the Jacks were on the verge of a major upset, Wentz was there to bring them crashing back down to earth.
Wentz cool under pressure, finds his man Kerry Woods. Woods near the first down marker, he's down at the 47. Second down, Wentz waiting for those routes to develop, fires to the middle, Urzendowski's got it.
There it is, right there.
To the 22-yard line, on first down for the Bison.
They got help at the bottom.
Wentz fires to the back of the end zone. Touchdown!
Wow, what a play.
And how could we not talk about their first, and to this point only showdown for the national title, which came back in 2023. Entering that big game, the Jacks were riding high on a 3-game winning streak over the Bison, which included a fantastic blowout victory in Fargo earlier in that season. After getting their doors blown off on their home turf, the Bison swore that this time things were going to be different. Unfortunately for them, reality was not so kind.
Is this the point where we'll see Tucker Kraft again? Motions over to the slot instead. Amar Johnson, big gainer. Johnson off and running, and that's a touchdown. Cody Mouth, the starting left tackle, arrived in Fargo as a walk-on, as a tight end. Kobe Johnson weaving his way for a first down, and the ball popped out. This season, remained active on the sidelines during games. He wore the headset. Hear all the communication happening. Wide open, and that's a touchdown. Jackson Yonke from 18 yards out. 3rd and 1. Johnson, the running back. Radowski. Jump pass, and there it is. Caught for the touchdown is Michael Morgan from 44 yards out.
Once again, the Jacks would dominate the final 3 quarters, outscoring the Bison 35-14 the rest of the way, securing their 2nd straight national title in the process. In all, the Dakota Marker is easily the premier rivalry in all of the FCS. In just 22 years' time, these two schools went from Division II all the way up to the very top of the FCS, becoming national powerhouses that routinely decide the national title. And with that incredible jump, the rivalry between them has gone on to be seen as one of the top rivalries across all 3 divisions of college football. And with that, we finally made it to the end. If you somehow made it all the way through this monstrosity, I just want to say thank you so much, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.